such a delight to be with you. And we're continuing today in your series in Ephesians, and we're looking at sacred households. But first of all, I'd like to bring you the greetings of my home church, Newton Mearns Baptist Church, which is in the suburbs of Glasgow. You can probably tell from my Glasgow accent. But I also want to bring you the greetings and prayers of Chicks. Chicks is a Bible study group that came out of our Alpha course and has become a deeply supportive community. And I know you have community groups that are deeply supportive for you. And as Chicks, we have been digging into the book of Luke this last year and discovering how Jesus, the all-powerful one, submitted himself to the great plans of God's kingdom, submitted himself to God's plan by becoming a human, tiny and vulnerable, and yet he was the one who made us in his image. Submitted himself to be baptized by John, and then the heavens open, as you'll remember, and God says, "This is my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." Submitted himself to his mother's request to help out a wedding. Submitted himself to the demands of people who wanted his time and attention. Submitted himself to being part of a group of disciples, friends together. And one day he stripped down, kneeling at their feet to serve them with care and attention, while they were busy looking at how they could be the center of attention, wondering which one could have the most power when the one who actually had the power served. And at Chicks, we've just finished chapter 23 of Luke, where Jesus submitted himself to God's big plan, begging to be free of the suffering he knew was coming his way, but willing to do what God's will was. He submitted to the judgments, the beatings, the scorn, the ridicule, and eventual killing. The one who had all the power submitted to those who thought they had power. Even though he knew he could in a moment have stopped all of this, he was willing to submit to God's greater plan so that humans could be back in a loving, intimate, tender, rule-free, selfless relationship with God. Jesus submitted himself. And the thing about submission is that it doesn't work unless you have power and are willing to set it aside. And submission is perceived as weak in our culture. But for Christians, for followers of Jesus, submission is one of the strongest, most selfless words. And it's also one of the strongest and most selfless acts. Submission models Christ-likeness. And the passage we're about to look at cannot be understood properly unless we grasp the impact of Jesus' submission on the way that we live. His submission affects the way that we live and breathe and have our being. And we cannot grasp the joy of this passage unless we realize that all things we do should be done out of reverence for Christ. Out of reverence for Christ. And as we're going to see in this passage, our love response to Jesus' submission is submission. Submission means setting aside what the culture, what our community, and sometimes even what our families think are our rights, putting others first. Setting aside our power so that the Holy Spirit's power could be at work in us. So we're going to have a look now at the passage. I'm going to ask Simon to come back up, and you're going to read that passage to us.
Thank you. Ephesians 5, starting at 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must also love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him.
Thanks. Well, as I said to Simon earlier, tricky passage. Well, seeing you ask a visiting speaker to tackle it rather than yourself, so thank you very much. I don't know about you, but I have read this passage as a set of rules that Paul has wanted to impose on Christians. But as I've studied this, what I realize is that what Paul is trying to do is help us see what is a response of our heart, of our very being, when we grasp hold of what Jesus has done and continues to do for us. And when we grasp hold of that, it impacts our home lives, our work lives, the places where others will encounter the radical response of our hearts to the love of Jesus. And our title for today is Sacred Households. Well, what was a sacred household in the first century Ephesus? Well, most of life was done around the household. You didn't so much go out to work, but you worked out of the home. There was little division between private and public life. It's kind of, think a bit more like, say, Downton Abbey, which my husband is currently obsessed with, which is totally weird. But anyway, but think more Downton Abbey. And when we hear the word slave, we tend to think about transatlantic slavery that Wilberforce campaigned against, or we think of modern day slavery, which is vile and should have absolutely no place in our society. But in first century Ephesus, slaves were a core part of the household. And I think it was Tom Wright who said that slavery was as essential and core to life then as electricity is to us now. And when we hear the words husbands and wives, perhaps you think of something romantic, but that actually wasn't the case then. Wives' main purpose was for childbearing, preferably male children. And men had many sexual partners. There was no celibacy, no real intimacy. They thought almost solely about their own needs and desires of their own body. And that was paramount in the culture and in the religious practice at the time. And when you hear the words children, you'll have in mind the way we as a society value children. Again, not so then. Children were disposed of if not needed. There was very high levels of infanticide, shocking, across the Roman Empire, particularly of girls, because boys were far more valued. And actually was a much higher proportion of men as a result than women in the population. So that's the context that Paul is calling for radical change, for households that were so distinctive from the culture, where each person was valued and confident in who they are in Jesus. And what Paul is calling his readers to a radical response to what Jesus has done. A radical submission, as I said at the start, of their own power, and a radical letting go of social norms, and a radical embracing of a new and sacred model of a household. Now, when you read it, the order in which we read is really significant. We read about wives before husbands, children before parents, slaves before masters. Now, for so long, honestly, I've read this as a pretty irritating command, addressing the ones I have perceived were expected to submit the most. But actually, Paul's intention here is to honor the ones who were considered the least by putting them first. They were normally never mentioned. So honoring those with the least power by showing them how they might radically transform their households by exerting what little power they had. Not in a manipulative way, but in a way that modeled what Jesus did, loving the other, modeling what Jesus did because as they loved, they saw the face of Jesus in the other. And Paul's intention is to help those with the most power to be like Jesus, not to hold on to power. So husbands who have the most power in their relationships are asked to set that aside and put love in its place, be alert to what's going on in the lives of their wives, which was just not what they thought about. Fathers, those men who were actually allowed to do what they wanted with their children, were being asked not to provoke their children, but to invest in them and help them flourish. And masters, those men who could do what they wanted with their slaves, were being asked to look after them as if they were looking after Jesus, to remember that they and their servants were equal in God's eyes. They were being asked to offer their slaves the same dignity that Jesus offered their slaves. So you see, when you follow Jesus, the way you treat everyone is based on the truth that they are made in God's image. And when you follow Jesus, your heart's desire is to be like Jesus in the way you treat others. When you follow Jesus, your heart's response is to set aside the way your culture expects you to behave, and instead to love unconditionally without expecting a return. And this is no wishy-washy, easy-ozy kind of faith. It's a radical challenge to society at that time. What happened was a sexual and social revolution. Now, we talk a lot about, particularly if you're my age, what the sexual revolution was in the 1960s, but it was nothing in comparison what happened in the first century 50s. It was something so radical that households changed and society changed. And Tom Holland, the historian, says that the baseline for human rights as we know them today began in the first century because of the way Christians submitted themselves to Christ. And then it absolutely enraged people in power. And that was often why you saw persecution happen to Christians at that time. They radically were disrupting society and culture. But somehow today, as Christians, we've gained the reputation for being oppressors rather than liberators, which is really disturbing. I mean, wouldn't it be great if today we enrage those in power because they see and experience Christians radically changing the way society and culture work as we live every aspect of our lives out of reverence for Christ? Now, you might think, well, I can't change culture and society. I'm not influential enough. I'm too old. I'm too young. Whatever. But Paul is saying here that change starts closest to home. So I totally believe that there's a place for campaigning and lobbying. I'm looking right at Matt, who does that so well. Many of you are involved in those kind of things. But the biggest difference that we can make is in our own everyday places. The way we treat our spouses, our children, our families, our guests, our colleagues. So what might people experience when they enter your 21st century household here in Bucks? What might it be? How do we model Christ-like submission, setting our rights in order for the others to flourish? So I'm going to try and look at these three areas. And I've really confessed that I'm quite nervous about it, because, well, for all sorts of reasons. And I don't know the details of your lives, but I do know that your current and past experience of work and family and marriage will all be different. And in these spaces, you will have experienced the deepest joy and the deepest hurt, the strongest bonds of trust, and the vilest of betrayals. And in the midst of that, God does not condemn you, but loves you unconditionally in the midst of your circumstances. So I'm not going to give you a set of rules because I don't believe Paul here is giving a set of rules. He's thinking about a way of life, a way of seeing, a way of thinking. So what I'm going to do is to pose some questions that you might want to think around. So we're going to put up the passages so as you can have a look at that. You might want to have your Bibles in front of you. So the first area we're kind of looking at is slaves and masters, and that's really our workplaces. So here's my questions for you. How do you treat your colleagues? For those of us who work for other people, how do we treat them? How do we speak of our bosses to others? When complaints are justifiable, what language might we use that shows we actually value even in the midst of that? And how do you work when left to your own devices, especially when working from home? We are asked here to work with enthusiasm because as we work, we are actually working for God. We're doing his work as we manage accounts, serve in shops, teach children, even doing the housework. And what about you who have teams and people you're responsible for? Do you remember that while you've different roles, you are both loved equally by God? Both of you are made in his image. When you've needfully difficult things to say, do you see Jesus before you and think how you speak tenderly to that person? Do you let Jesus shape your words and conversation? How you treat colleagues should give them a glimpse of Jesus. I recently heard an interview with John and Gilbert Lennox, and they were being interviewed by someone from Oka, and they were being asked about their life at home, and they were saying their experience at home was of a father in the midst of the troubles in Northern Ireland, a father who chose deliberately to employ Catholics and Protestants when that was just not the done thing. And he said, every person is made in the image of God. And they talked about the impact that had on them when they saw how their father worked, the difference it made in their lives, and it helped them with their faith walk. So believe me when I say your work practices, the way you talk about colleagues, the way you treat them, the respect you have for them has an impact way beyond the workplace. It impacts your kids and how they grow into followers of Jesus. And that leads us into parenting, this next sort of section about children obeying your parents. So what happens to in your family space? Because it's one of the most formative places, I think, for adults and children alike. Now, the message translates a bit of this like, fathers, don't frustrate your children with no-win scenarios. You'll recognize doing that, won't you? But take them by the hand and lead them in the way of the master. So parents, how are you leading your children in the way of the master? What do they see modeled in your home? What do they see in the way you live for Jesus? Do they see you overly busy with no time for them, only pushing them on to achieve? Or do they experience radical and unconditional love? Or do they feel that you're forcing rules and regulations on them? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus talks about, I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. He talks about the yoke that he puts on us. So I wonder, in your home, do your children experience unforced rhythms of grace? Do you lay heavy and ill-fitting burdens on them? Or do they experience a family that lives freely and lightly before Jesus? And I don't think there's many young children in the room at the moment, but all of us are children in some way. So children, us who have old parents, how do you go about obeying your parents? As I thought, I've been thinking about the verse, if you honor your father and mother, things will go well with you and you'll have a long life on earth. I'm thinking, what's that about? And I've been thinking about, when a home's in conflict, you certainly feel as if it's shortening your life, don't you? And there's something about how do we make sure that our children, that we're able creating the right sort of space for our children and our families. I think that children, whatever age we are, have the most power in the relationship between children and parents. Because our parents long for our love, long to see you doing well, long to be the best parent that you possibly can be. So this is my question to you who are children, whatever age. How are you leading your parents in the way of the Master? What is your posture towards your parents? Where do you think you need to submit to their power? Do you create spaces and places where good conversation can happen? Have you created habits and habits and moments where everyone has the right to speak and speak well and voices to be heard? Do you create those opportunities where as a family, whatever stage you are, you have a chance to reorientate your life before Jesus? Reorientate that hard week, or the hard week you've had, or maybe that hard year. The kind of culture we have in our families is really significant. Well, what about marriage? So, big section here, isn't it? Now, I think if you read that passage, I'm not sure what I can helpfully add to that, because it seemed to me quite explicit, particularly if you view all the things said here and written here in the light of submitting to others out of reverence for Christ. And I always find myself hesitant to speak about this, because every marriage is different, and not all have happy ever after endings, let alone happy middles. And I'm always conscious as well, of what's going on in our own family life, not always perfect. But what I don't believe here is that Paul's speaking to condemn, but he's rather challenging Christian marriage to be different from what's the norm in society of the time. We spoke at the start about how even thinking about the other in marriage and looking out for their best was radical. So what might this passage say to those who are married? Well, I wonder if you look for the best in the other. Take time to notice what their needs are. In your marriage, it might be small things you need to notice. I was asking my husband, what was it that he needed? He said, stop putting seeds in my porridge. So that's, but, helpful. I was hoping for something profound, But it may be choosing to build the other up rather than put them down, because it's so easy to do that, particularly when they're being so stupid. Sorry, excuse me. But when you're feeling enraged about that. So. But husbands, in a society like ours, where body image is so important, do you take care of your wives in the same way you take care of your body, attentive to the details of their life and their nourishment? Where do you make space for Jesus in your marriage, in our busy lives at home, sport, family priorities, serving in the church? We can take our eyes off Jesus and lose sight of him. It will be different at different stages, but whatever stage, do you look for the best in the other? Do you cherish the other? And wives, is the relationship you have with Jesus reflected in the way you treat your husband? The message puts it this way: wives, understand and support your husbands in ways that show your support for Christ. Do you let your husband love you enough? Now, I have a very old friend, Mo, in church, and her husband has just died, and she used to say to me, I think husbands love more than wives. Now, I don't know if that's your experience or even my experience, but in marriages, often what we can do is dismiss the love of the one who loves the most. And I think what Paul means here when he writes is, no one hates his own body, but feeds and cares for it, just as Christ cares for the church, and we are members of his body. I think what he's saying is, in marriage, care for each other as if you are caring for Jesus. So then, what is a sacred household? A sacred house is a place where God is welcome among us. It's a place where God is at the center. Even if not everybody in our household loves Jesus, those who do love Jesus create an atmosphere of mutuality, not hierarchy. of honoring and preferring the other. A sacred household is a visible picture of the invisible reality of the love and power of Jesus. A sacred household is a place of subversive submission where people feel liberated to be the person God calls them to be. Now, you may think what we've been talking about feels impossible, but Jesus, who submitted himself for you, dwells in you. His Spirit gives you the power to make your household sacred. Okay, so what about is there some practical example that might help bring all this to life? I've been asking a number of my friends as I've been preparing, with all sorts of suggestions. And really, as I was praying for this, I came across an old photo of my dad. And it's a really terrible photo. Here it is, very out of focus. But it was the very last one that was taken of him before he died. And it's a picture of him telling a story at his younger brother's 80th birthday celebration. And the story that he told was that he and my uncle, as young men, had gone out at night under the cover of dark with their dad. And their task was to conduct some holy graffiti. And on the A80 near Moodiesburn, for those of you who know Scotland, it was a busy road. There was a great big stone. And my grandfather climbed up the ladder, which they held tight for him. And he painted, "Jesus died for your sins," on that big rock. You see, my grandpa had been saved in an amazing way, and he passionately loved Jesus and wanted other people to discover God's amazing love. He wanted them to know God's powerful rescue plan. And that little bit of graffiti was just one of the ways he used to share Jesus. I still come across people who, it's long ago been blown up and a new motorway put in place, but I still come across people who remember that sign. It was in their home that my dad and uncle learned the joy of following Jesus. What modeled in their home helped set the trajectory of their lives. And so in our home, when I was a child, there was also always a welcome for strangers. There were five of us, so there were 7 in our family. We never knew whether there would be 7 or 27 sitting down for dinner. He'd often be an invitation round the table. And as children, we learned to make conversation, learned to express our views. We met people of different faiths, and we met those who'd given up their lives to serve Jesus in all places around the world. We all, as children, had a place around that table. And I still meet people who tell me that my parents were like Jesus to them. What we saw as children was a marriage modeled where they'd figured out how to support each other. It wasn't perfect, but my mum enabled the enormous ministry of my dad as a doctor, many other things that he did. He used to say, "She keeps the show on the road." They looked for the best in each other, spoke well of each other, expected us to show respect for them, and expected us to show respect to each other. They had no favorites amongst the 5 of us, but looked for each to thrive. So the morning after telling this story, my dad collapsed, was rushed to hospital, and died 5 days later, 2 days before his 83rd birthday. And in these 4 days, as he died, he reflected on his life. It's a really holy time to do that. And he explained to us that he'd known 3 passions in his life. His job. He'd absolutely loved being a doctor, and the difference he'd been able to make to the lives of so many people. It was where he worked out much of his faith. His second passion was his marriage and his family, and he told us how much he loved Mum and how proud he was of his children and his grandchildren. We had brought him joy. And his third passion was Jesus. Dad loved the adventure Jesus had taken on and was amazed at Jesus' love for him. Truthfully, We actually didn't need him to tell us any of that about his passions, for he'd lived them out in front of us and in front of the people he'd worked and served with. It was in our sacred household that I learned the joy of following Jesus. What was modeled in our home helped set the trajectory of my life and my faith, and now in my home. He had taken us, his children, by the hand and led us in the way of the Master. Now, I tell you that story because I want you to know that a sacred household is actually quite an ordinary household. It's not a perfect household, but it's one where people are welcomed, loved, nourished, and helped flourish. Today, as I look at the photo of him, I'm reminded that what we model in our home and our work and in our lives can help set the trajectory of a life of faith in our children and in other people. That is a sacred household.